Fred Frieberger. This is episode 53.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
He probably had one of the toughest jobs in Star Trek's history, yet he stayed with the show to the very end. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casco. This week, we tell you all about the show producer for the third season, Fred Frieberger.
But first, let me tell everyone how they can find us. Just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70strek.
You can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com. And you can find the show on iTunes. Just search 70s Trek in the podcast section. While you're there, please leave a rating or a review because that helps other people find the show.
He's probably one of the most misunderstood guys connected to the original series. In fact, the blame for the disappointing third season has been placed at Fred Frieberger's feet, and I'll be honest with you, Kelly, I'm not sure that's fair.
I agree. Nobody could have saved the show in 1968 or 69, not with everything that it was facing.
Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Kelly, you took a look at Fred Frieberger's life and career before Star Trek, right?
Absolutely. So we'll start with Fred was born February 19th, 1915 in Bronx, New York City, and that's where he grew up. Late 1930s, he started working in advertising. When World War II broke out, he joined the 8th Air Force as a navigator on a bomber. He was stationed in England. They were flying a mission over Germany, and they were shot down.
Oh my gosh, another World War II hero.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he spent 22 months as a POW in Germany.
Wow.
Well, once he came home, he briefly studied at the Institute of Film at Pace University before making his way to Hollywood, and he used his Air Force back pay to get there. Now, when he got there, he was looking for a job as a film publicist. But guess what? There was a strike going on in the film studio strike, and so he couldn't get a job as a film publicist. And he's unemployed. He's pretty much spent all his money. So he decided, I'm going to go be a screenwriter, pick up a job, making some money doing writing. He sold his first story to Comet Productions. Now, this was a production company owned by Mary Pickford.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Silent movie star.
Yes, right. So over time, he picked up other things. His very first, though, science fiction writing effort, was with the anthology TV series The Clock in 1949. Now, he sold many stories to television and movies. Some of the television series, The Clock, as I mentioned, Fireside Theater, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Ford Television Theater, Men of Annapolis, Tombstone, Territory. But like in 1953, he had a stint of writing scripts for movies. 53 was a few, Egypt by Three and War Paint. And there was another one that is a cult classic that he co-wrote. There was, I think, 4 total writers on this. It's called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Oh, nice.
So he was kind of busy in 1953. There was 3 there. 1954, he had 3 as well. The Big Chase, The Black Pirates, and then a Western starring Gary Cooper and Susan Hayworth called Garden of Evil. 1955, The Big Bluff. 56, he wrote The Massacre and The Weapon. 57, Beginning and End. And then in 1958, he wrote Blood Arrow, and then his very last motion picture credit, which is Crash Landing. Now, after Crash Landing, Frieberger really focused his time on TV. And that's pretty much what he did for the rest of his career. He focused on TV. And more importantly, for this time, he was one of the most prolific writers for Western teleplays. So he did things, Cheyenne, Rawhide, those kind of things. Then he switched to being a producer, which is what we know him from.
Mm-hmm.
His first assignment as a producer came in 1960 on the medical drama Ben Casey. Then that followed a short stint on Wild Wild West. And now Wild Wild West, and he did this in the first season, so 65, 66. This was really his first significant contribution to science fiction.
What a fun show, too.
Oh, yeah. Loved it.
Now, did he produce all the seasons, the whole show?
No. So he was originally brought in to devise ingenious cliffhangers, and I'm quoting here because I can't come up with the word ingenious, and offbeat futuristic gadgets, which we know that show had tons of it for being a Western.
It did. Yep. That was part of the reason that I love that show.
Oh, me too. And I, part of me, and I didn't read this, so I'm just speculating that he set the tone for that. I mean, obviously they brought him in to do the work, but he really set the tone. Now, he had some problems, though. To do this, to have these complicated plots and, with cliffhangers and these futuristic gadgets, it costs money.
Mm.
And this caused some problems between him as a producer and CBS. And so after only 10 episodes, he was let go.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah. Now, at this time, and you might have this, Bob, so I'll just touch on it. So at this time, Gene Roddenberry approaches him to be the producer for Star Trek. But guess Frieberger, he had other plans. He went to Europe on a vacation that he'd been planning, so he declined. So there's his first brush with Star Trek.
And who got that job?
Gene Kuhn. Yeah.
So let me jump in here if it's okay.
Absolutely.
With what happened at the beginning of season 3, Gene Roddenberry told NBC that he would be willing to come back and produce the show as he had in the first season if NBC gave them a good time slot. And if they didn't give him a good time slot, Roddenberry threatened to leave the show. Well, NBC put the show on at Fridays at 10 p.m. when their audience would not be home. So feeling like he had to do it, Roddenberry says, I just had to leave the show because they called my bluff. So it was all I could do. Well, not really. You could have produced the damn show, Gene.
Well, right.
And so he interviewed Fred Frieberger to be his replacement. Now, Gene knew that Fred had not written any Star Trek stories or scripts, so he asked Fred to write one. Fred came back and said, I'm not interested in auditioning. Buy me based on my past experience or hire someone else. I love that.
Yes.
So Gene could have turned to the network. This is also what's kind of noteworthy here. He could have turned to the network and studio at that point and fought for associate producer Bob Justman to become the show producer. He had a discussion with Justman in the first season saying that if he, Gene, ever left the show, that Justman would be the right guy to take over. So Justman thinks that if Gene is going to move on to be an executive producer, that he's going to get the job as show producer.
Makes sense.
But Gene doesn't fight for him. Instead, he chooses the path of least resistance and hired Frieberger. So before Frieberger was hired, Roddenberry has this conversation with Justman, lets him know. Justman, of course, is not happy, and despite his unhappy feelings, he jumps in and he helps Frieberger get up to speed. Frieberger's first day on the job was April 1st, 1968. That's April Fool's Day.
Yes.
And Justman, in his book that he wrote with Herb Solow, Inside Star Trek, makes note of that. And he says there was some strange irony in that fact. So it was made clear that Frieberger was to be the man, because Gene actually turned over his very spacious office to him, as well as giving him the title. Even though Gene was the executive producer, he ends up leaving the building where the Star Trek offices are housed and moves clear across to the other side of Paramount's lot. And he was barely involved with Star Trek after that. So you have to think about this from Frieberger's point of view. He may have been the king of this particular, castle, Star Trek's production, but the castle was sinking into a marsh.
Yeah, it was.
Listen to what was going on here. Shatner and Nimoy were feuding about screen time. The show's budget had been severely cut by $9,000 per episode. Now, in 1968, that's a lot of money per episode. Oh, yeah. That really crippled the show. Desilu had been purchased by Paramount, and they weren't sure that they wanted Star Trek around at all. Desilu's executive in charge of production, Herb Solow, who not only helped bring the show to Desilu, but also helped sell it to NBC, he's gone in the third season. He's over at MGM working over there. On top of all of this, NBC has moved the show to Fridays at 10. So their audience isn't watching. And Fred Frieberger finds himself alone at the top of this. And his executive producer doesn't want to be bothered and doesn't want to help him. And he doesn't know or understand Star Trek. And there's only one guy that can really help him, and that's Bob Justman. There's nobody else around to hold Frieberger's hand and get him going. In an interview in the 90s, Fred Frieberger's daughter, Lisa, said that turning shows around that were in trouble was his kind of thing, and he liked challenges. But then she went on to say this, quote, "But I do think this was a job that most people would absolutely not have accepted. The challenges were crazy, and I think he knew a lot of that going in. I think going in, he knew that the show was going to be abandoned." Well, think of that word, abandoned.
Wow.
But as Herb Solow described in the book that he wrote with Justman, Inside Star Trek, not everything Fred dealt with was bad. Some of it was just weird. Here's an interesting story that happened as he was moving into Gene's office. Fred noticed a peephole that had been drilled into the office door. When he asked about it, Justman told him, well, Gene had that put in so he could look out and see when his first wife was in the outer office. Frieberger said that he realized then and there that this was going to be a strange new world.
Yes. Wow.
So diving into the production, Frieberger immediately saw that he needed writing support. So he hired Arthur Singer, someone he had worked with at other jobs. And actually, this was a guy that had Bob Justman gotten the job, Justman had already decided he was going to hire Singer as well. And as production began, it was clear that the stories were turning out to be different. Gene didn't get involved with any of the rewrites, so none of the third season shows have that Roddenberry touch to them. And I think that's why the third season seems so different to fans. The guys that were involved in season 1 and season 2 were not there in season 3.
Right.
Frieberger found out at a network meeting early on just how much animosity there was between NBC and the show's creator, Roddenberry. Quote, I was amazed at the contempt with which Roddenberry treated them, and I could see they didn't like him at all. I thought to myself, holy shit, what have I gotten myself into, unquote. And of his relationship with NBC, one of their executives said, quote, Fred was hated the moment he stepped through the door at Star Trek. He couldn't escape what Roddenberry had put in place from the walkout over the time slot change. It was a no-win position, unquote. So with all of that, Frieberger became resentful because no one had really given him the lay of the land before he took the job. Can you imagine?
Well, and they laid up a whole bunch of landmines in front of him, too.
A whole bunch of landmines. And actually, he found out day after day just how many problems and how many fires he had to put out. Here's one, for example. They were watching every nickel, the studio was. So they sent him a note one day saying, hey, Bill Shatner has put in an expense for his breakfast, and it was $15. That's a hell of a lot of money for breakfast in 1968. Go find out what was going on. And so he goes to Shatner, and he says, hey, Bill, I got this, and, could you explain it? And Shatner says, oh, well, yeah, I had eggs, I had bacon, I had some toast and coffee, and I think it was $7.50. And Frieberger says, but Bill, you expensed $15. And he said, well, yeah, $7.50 times 2, because I fed my dog too. That's the kind of stuff he was dealing with. So as the production progressed in the third season, the tensions between Shatner and Nimoy really began to wear on Frieberger because both of them would come to him and want more screen time. Nimoy wanted more script pages for Spock. Shatner heard about it and would go to him and say, hey, don't forget, I'm the star of the show. And finally it got so bad that Frieberger called a meeting and he invited Shatner, Nimoy, and Roddenberry. And as he's sitting in this meeting, he says, look, here's what's going on. And this situation and bickering has gotten so bad that it's keeping me from doing my job. And he looked at Gene. Gene jumped up and said, gee, I'm sorry to hear that, Fred. I hope you get it straightened out, and headed for the door.
Oh, my gosh. This is the executive producer who's still getting money from this.
Yes. And don't forget, he's the guy who put all of this in place.
Right.
Well, in Frieberger's eyes, he had inherited this problem, and he felt that Roddenberry should be the one to put it to rest. So before Gene left, he said, Gene, please, wait. Tell me, who is the star of the series? Is it Bill or is it Leonard? And that really put Roddenberry on the spot, and he didn't say anything, and he kind of looked around the room, and he pulled out a cigarette, and he was fumbling with it, and he walked over to the window and lit the cigarette, and when he turned back around, he said, Fred, you're really putting me on the spot here. And he was sweating, and he was staring with anger in his eyes at Frieberger. And Frieberger responded, I'm sorry, Gene, but I have to know. And Gene turned around again and headed for the door, and he stopped at the door, turned back, and he said, it's Bill. Bill's the star of the series. And then he walked out, and he was PO'd. And he was PO'd because Frieberger made him say that in front of both Shatner and Nimoy.
Yeah.
So while this might have fixed Frieberger's problem on the short term, it really sort of hurt him over the long term. Shatner was happy. He goes back to the set and he's smiling. Hey, I am the star,
Yeah.
But Nimoy's pissed. And Roddenberry's pissed. And Roddenberry held it against him really for the rest of his life. But
well,
you know what?
I'm sure that doesn't help with everybody's perception of the third season, too.
Right, exactly. But think about the position he was in. I got this problem. You hired me to do this job, and you're not helping me. You need to help me. You put this all in place. So if that wasn't bad enough, in April 1968, and this was just past the midpoint of the season's production, they had about 14 episodes shot. Co-producer Bob Justman decides he's had enough, and he put in his notice and quit the show. And he was going to go work with Herb Solow over at MGM. Think about that. Now Frieberger was really alone. Ugh.
Yeah.
Jeez. So Fred continues on, does the best he can do. And it's interesting because there is a letter that Gene wrote to a friend in January of 1969. And in it, he talks about Frieberger a little bit. While he doesn't name him, he says, I'm inclined by pride to remove my name from the program, since it is being made by someone else now, and comes out quite different in important ways from the way I envisioned the show. I don't want to publicly condemn or embarrass the man who is producing the show. He works hard and makes the kind of show he has been taught in television as a good show. Perhaps I should have dropped him mid-season, but there simply wasn't anyone better in sight to replace him. Wow, that was Gene talking about Fred Frieberger, and they were still in production on the show.
Oh, my gosh.
So, obviously, the show limps. We know that in early 1968, the crew gets word, hey, it's canceled. And everybody moves on to their next gigs, you know. Gene Kuhn, who had worked on the show in the first and second season, well, he's long gone. Herb Solow and Bob Justman are now making a show called Then Came Bronson over at MGM. They're gone. Gene Roddenberry has moved off the Paramount lot and was writing a script for a Tarzan movie. William Shatner was fielding offers to star in other series and went off to perform some off-Broadway plays. Leonard Nimoy joined the cast of Mission Impossible. And there's Fred Frieberger, who had to stay on the Paramount lot for 4 more weeks and supervise the editing of the last Star Trek episodes so they could be delivered to NBC. So here's the last guy to join the Star Trek team, and he was also the last guy to leave it. You know, many Star Trek fans have criticized Frieberger for being the cause of Star Trek's decline and even the reason why the show got canceled. But Nichelle Nichols came to his defense, and she wrote this, quote, Fred Frieberger did everything he could to shore up the show. Star Trek was in a disintegrating orbit before Fred came aboard. That we were able to do even what we did is a miracle and a credit to him. You know, after Star Trek, Frieberger was the script editor and producer for Space 1999, and we've talked about that show here. And he's credited with reworking that show to make it more appealing to American audiences. But interestingly enough, in season 2, he kind of took the show in a different direction, and Martin Landau wanted nothing to do with him or the show and wouldn't even promote the show.
Yeah.
In the 70s, he also worked on shows like All in the Family, Ironside, Emergency, Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space, Scooby-Doo, Super Friends, SWAT, The $6 Million Man, Vegas, Starsky and Hutch, and the Dukes of Hazzard. In 93, Frieberger was asked about his time working on the show, Star Trek. Here's what he had to say. Quote, I thought I could never have a more unpleasant experience in my life than when I, a Jewish kid from the Bronx, parachuted out of a burning B-17 over Germany to land in the midst of 80 million Nazis. But that was before my association with Star Trek. My ordeal in a German prison camp only lasted 2 years. My travail with Star Trek has spanned 25 years and still counting. Unquote. Wow.
Yeah.
Clearly he was feeling the heat.
Yeah, when you compare being in a German prison camp versus
2
years or 1 year of Star Trek.
Oh my God, right. You know, when the 20th anniversary party for Star Trek was being planned in 1986, Gene Roddenberry made it known that there were two people that he didn't want to have at that party. If they were there, he wasn't going to go. One was Herb Solow. The other was Fred Frieberger. Kelly, do you have any closing thoughts about Fred Frieberger?
Well, I don't think Fred Frieberger would have wanted to go anyways.
I don't think so either.
Well, so I watched a documentary hosted by Herb Solow, and it was about Solow and Justman's book Inside Star Trek, The Real Story.
I've seen that. That's a great documentary.
It is, but you could just tell that the whole theme was we're setting the record straight.
Yes. And who are they setting the record straight from? Yeah, I know. Do we even want to say it? I feel like we're in a Harry Potter movie and we dare not say his name.
Exactly.
Mr. Roddenberry said a lot of things and created his own record. Right. And let's just put it this way. There are differing opinions. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, but overall, I think that Solow and Justman really defend Frieberger. Don't you? I mean, everything I've read and that series.
I do. I agree with you. I think that their take is that Gene should not have left the show, that Frieberger was given a no-win scenario, so to speak.
Right.
Using a Star Trek phrase, and had zero support from the creator. From the guy who knew it the best, he had no support. With all of the hurdles that were thrown at him on day one, by the way, all of those hurdles we talked about earlier in this episode, how was he supposed to get ahead?
Well, it's like Nichelle said, it was already in a downward spiral. And how do you come out of it? Right? Yeah, I don't think you can.
I don't think you can either, especially when Roddenberry so upset NBC. You already had the network out to kill the show. You had a new studio that didn't like the show and thought it was underwater financially. Those two things alone are enough to kill it.
Right.
Never mind all of the infighting and bickering and all of the other problems that were going on. My final take or my closing thoughts are this. Frieberger gets a lot of grief for being the guy who killed Star Trek. In fact, I used to be one of those guys. That damn Frieberger. You've heard me say it.
Oh, yeah. I have too.
And I have to admit, after researching for this show, I will not say that anymore. I think it's pretty incredible that he did not quit. And he remained on the job to the very end, and he delivered. Not Gene, not Justman, not anybody else. Fred Frieberger delivered the last episode of Star Trek to NBC. Next week, we ask what all Star Trek fans have wondered for decades.
Whatever happened to Janice Rand, Kevin Riley, and Dr. Mabenga?
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.